In Switzerland and Canada, members of the Order of the Solar Temple did not simply disappear into an isolated commune. They died in carefully organized episodes that investigators described as mass killings and suicides, carried out in the 1990s under the shadow of an apocalyptic belief system. The central question is not whether these people were irrational. It is how educated, prosperous adults were persuaded that death could be planned as a sacred escape. The order presented itself as an esoteric society, drawing on spiritual teachings, ritual symbolism, and ideas about humanity's destiny among the stars. Its name suggested light, discipline, and ancient wisdom. Its inner structure was far more controlling. Members were encouraged to believe that ordinary society was approaching collapse and that only an initiated few understood what was coming. Apocalyptic anxiety became more than fear. It became a framework for every decision. Two men stood at the center of that framework: Jouret, a physician and charismatic speaker, and Joseph de Mambro, the organization's behind-the-scenes authority. A charismatic leader is someone whose personal certainty, magnetism, and claim to special insight can persuade followers to treat influence as evidence of truth. Jouret supplied public spiritual authority. De Mambro helped construct the rituals, hierarchy, and secretive world in which that authority operated. The order recruited people who could bring education, money, professional skills, and social credibility. That detail matters because it shattered a comforting myth about cults. Vulnerability is not limited to the uneducated or the visibly desperate. A person can be intelligent, financially secure, and highly competent, yet still be exposed to manipulation when a group offers certainty, belonging, and an explanation for frightening events. Recruitment often begins with affirmation rather than threats. Love bombing is the deliberate use of intense attention, praise, and apparent emotional intimacy to make a newcomer feel uniquely recognized. In a group like the Solar Temple, that welcome could be connected to a larger promise. You are not merely joining an association, you are being admitted to a hidden order with a higher purpose. Belonging became proof of selection. The first commitment did not need to seem extreme. It might involve attending private gatherings, accepting specialized teachings, or trusting a leader's interpretation of ritual. Each step created a small investment. Then came secrecy. Information was controlled according to rank, and members were encouraged to see outsiders as spiritually blind or morally unprepared. Isolation does not always require physical walls. Sometimes it is built from suspicion. The psychological mechanism is known as cognitive dissonance. It is the mental strain produced when a person's actions conflict with their earlier beliefs or self-image. If a devoted member encountered contradictions, admitting the group was deceptive would also mean confronting years of sacrifice, damaged relationships, and misplaced trust. It could feel safer to reinterpret the contradiction as a test, a mystery, or evidence that deeper commitment was required. That pattern helps explain why warnings may fail to break a group's hold. A criticism from police, relatives, or former members can be recast as persecution. Doubt becomes a sign of weakness. Obedience becomes a sign of maturity. The more a follower gives up, the more psychologically expensive withdrawal becomes. The order's danger grew through this accumulation of commitments, not through one dramatic command at the beginning. The movement's teachings placed death inside a ritual vocabulary. Members were told that their existence could continue through a transition to a higher state, associated with the star Sirius. This was not a supernatural fact established by evidence. It was a belief system presented as secret knowledge. The promise transformed mortality into a passage, while the leaders positioned themselves as guides capable of controlling when and how that passage would occur. That idea became linked to the order's transit ritual. The word transit sounds orderly, almost administrative, but in this context it referred to a supposed passage from earthly life into a higher spiritual state. Ritual can make an abstract claim feel physically real. Clothing, timing, symbols, ceremonies, and carefully managed spaces can narrow attention until the group's narrative seems more immediate than the outside world. Why would anyone accept such a terrible conclusion? Because apocalyptic belief does not always arrive as panic. It can arrive as relief. If the world is doomed, ordinary responsibilities lose their meaning. If death is redefined as advancement, fear can be portrayed as an obstacle to overcome. A leader who controls the timetable of salvation also controls the emotional atmosphere, turning anxiety into obedience and obedience into a measure of faith. Mambro's authority depended on maintaining an aura of hidden access. The group's secrecy made verification difficult, while ritualized experiences could be used to reinforce the impression that unseen forces were endorsing the leadership. Investigative accounts have described staged spiritual phenomena associated with the order, but the larger psychological point is more important than any single performance. When leaders manufacture evidence, they are not merely deceiving members, they are reshaping what members consider evidence. Jouret's public role added another layer. His background and confident presentation could make extraordinary claims appear medically, intellectually, or spiritually respectable. That is a recurring danger in elite cults. Status does not eliminate manipulation. Sometimes it conceals it. Professional language, refined settings, and influential contacts can create a polished surface behind which coercive control remains difficult to recognize. The order's members were not simply passive recipients of instructions. They interpreted, defended, and sometimes helped transmit the system to others. That is how high-control groups become durable. Beliefs are reinforced horizontally through friendships and shared obligations, as well as vertically through the leader. A member may fear disappointing the group more than displeasing one individual, because rejection threatens an entire social identity. By the early 1990s, the order's internal logic had become increasingly focused on destiny and departure. Records and investigations indicate that the deaths were not one single event, but a series of episodes in Switzerland and Canada. The locations differed, yet the underlying pattern remained recognizable: preparation, ritual meaning, controlled participation, and an outcome interpreted through the group's doctrine. The involvement of Canada is especially significant because it showed that the order's system was not confined to one European network. A cross-border organization could carry its ideology, relationships, and operational habits across national boundaries. Geography did not weaken the leadership's influence. It complicated the investigation and made the tragedy harder to understand as a local disturbance. The order functioned as a transnational belief community with lethal consequences. Investigators found evidence of planning and organization rather than an unstructured wave of spontaneous despair. That distinction matters. Calling the events only suicides can obscure the role of authority, preparation, and violence within the group. Calling them only murders can obscure the indoctrination that persuaded some participants to cooperate in their own deaths. The most accurate account must hold both realities together: coercive leadership and conditioned belief. The use of fire carried symbolic force inside the order's worldview, but it also had a practical consequence. It destroyed evidence and intensified confusion. Fire can be described by a group as purification or release, yet those meanings belong to the ideology, not to objective reality. The deaths were human actions shaped by manipulation, planning, and belief. No supernatural explanation is required to understand them. After the deaths, surviving members faced a psychological landscape that investigators and relatives could not easily enter. Some had lost friends, partners, or entire circles of trust. Others had to confront the possibility that the leaders they revered had engineered the very catastrophe they had promised to prevent. Exit counseling, sometimes called deprogramming, is a process intended to help a person examine coercive beliefs and rebuild independent judgment. It cannot erase grief or restore lost years. The tragedy also exposed the limitations of public assumptions about cults. Many people imagine a visibly isolated leader surrounded by unquestioning followers, living far from respectable society. The Solar Temple challenged that image. Its members could appear sophisticated, connected, and self-directed, yet intelligence is not an immunity to social pressure. Under conditions of secrecy, fear, admiration, and escalating commitment, reasoning can be recruited in the service of almost any conclusion. The order did not collapse because one argument defeated its theology. It died because its internal promises led toward an irreversible act, and because the leader's control transformed a spiritual narrative into a system of preparation for death. Once that threshold was crossed, the language of higher existence could no longer conceal the consequences. The temple's most devastating revelation was not about the stars. It was about power on Earth. Switzerland and Canada remain linked by the same unanswered warning. A cult does not need to reject modern life completely in order to become dangerous. It only needs to make one authority more trustworthy than reality, one doctrine more important than human ties, and one fearful future more compelling than the present. The Solar Temple's members were told that they were escaping the end of the world. In the end, it was the group's own controlled world that made the deaths possible. Subscribe.